My eyes stayed completely dry when that image popped up on my screen. I need to make that absolutely clear right from the start, because anyone who gets wind of what happened invariably presses me on that exact detail. They want to know if I had a breakdown, if I scrambled to call someone, or if I immediately poured myself a stiff drink to numb the shock. The truth is much simpler. I did none of those things. I just sat there at my kitchen counter at precisely 6:43 a.m., staring at my phone while holding a mug of coffee that had turned ice cold an hour ago. In that quiet moment, something deep inside my chest hardened into a heavy, unyielding shape. A feeling I hadn't experienced since my wife passed away back in 2017. It wasn't a wave of sadness, and it wasn't even white-hot anger. At least, not in those first few minutes. It was the sudden, freezing clarity that washes over a man when he realizes the very ground he has been walking on for over 3 decades wasn't solid earth at all, but just a thin sheet of glass. My actual name isn't important for this account. What matters is that I am 68 years old, living on a quiet piece of land just outside Eugene, Oregon. For 34 years, I built and ran a regional freight and supply chain company, starting it from a single cramped warehouse in Portland and growing it into something substantial. When I sold off the majority stake 5 years ago, I walked away with more than enough to ensure I would never have to glance at a price tag for the rest of my days. Yet, you won't find a luxury watch on my wrist. I still get behind the wheel of a 10-year-old Ford pickup, and I buy my plain button-down shirts from the exact same department store I've used for decades. My late wife used to smile and poke fun at my stubborn habits, telling me I dressed like someone desperately trying to stay under the radar of the tax authorities, even though my books were flawlessly clean. I always told her that was precisely the strategy. Letting the world see your wealth is nothing more than putting a target on your back for people looking to strip it away from you. We had just one child, a son. I am going to refer to him simply as my boy throughout this account, because even now, after everything that has transpired, it feels far too painful to utter his actual name to strangers. He turned 31 this past autumn. He holds a degree in corporate finance from a university where I took care of every single tuition bill and textbook fee without him ever seeing an invoice. For the past 7 years, he has been living in a beautiful 4-bedroom craftsman home located on a peaceful, tree-lined avenue in Bend, Oregon. I purchased that property outright in 2018 and placed it securely inside a revocable trust, naming him strictly as the designated resident, not the property owner. Just the resident. The trust handled the annual property taxes, and the trust took care of the homeowner's insurance. He has cruised through his entire adult life without ever knowing the crushing weight of a monthly mortgage payment, because there was simply no debt to clear. I personally made sure of that the moment the title cleared. That life-altering photograph appeared on a quiet Sunday morning. I remember it vividly because I casually opened a social media application on my device while waiting for the coffee machine to finish brewing. I rarely spend time on those platforms, logging in perhaps twice a week at most, just to view the updates my niece shares of her young children up in Seattle. But on that specific morning, the platform's delivery system decided to place my own son's face right at the top of my feed. There he was, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit I had never laid eyes on before, positioned beneath an elaborate archway woven with hundreds of white roses, his arm wrapped tightly around a young woman clad in a traditional bridal gown. Standing proudly on either side of the couple were her parents, both grinning broadly with the triumphant expressions of people who had just hit a massive jackpot. The short statement written beneath the image read, "With the family that has always been there for me," written in that casual, uncapitalized manner the younger generation prefers, punctuated by 3 tiny heart symbols at the very end. I read those words a second time, then a third. I clicked into the post and began scrolling, discovering a gallery of 47 separate images. 47. The entire event was laid out before me, the exchanging of vows, the formal dinner, the cutting of the cake, and their first dance as a married couple. Several of the digital files retained their original entry markers, indicating the ceremony had taken place the very afternoon before at a picturesque vineyard located just outside Redmond, roughly 45 miles from the exact spot where I sat staring at my screen. I had been completely alone at home during those exact hours. I knew precisely how I had spent that Saturday afternoon. I was working outside on my property, replacing a length of weathered wood that had begun to rot on my back porch. I had paused to fix myself a quick meal at 1 o'clock, and later in the evening, I watched a bit of a football game on television. My only child had joined his life to another person less than an hour's drive from my doorstep, and I had spent that time eating a simple deli sandwich in an empty house. I didn't dial his number, I didn't send a text message, and I didn't reach out to any of our extended relatives who undoubtedly knew the wedding was taking place. I simply flipped the device face down onto the wooden counter, finished the cold remains of my drink, and watched the early sunlight crest over the mountain ridge behind my property, while a rush of old memories flooded my mind. Very few of those thoughts had anything to do with the actual wedding ceremony. Instead, my mind drifted back to my wife and the rainy night our son was born at the county hospital, remembering how she held that tiny infant against her shoulder and whispered that we were going to protect him and raise him right. I pictured the old parking lot where I spent hours running alongside his bicycle in 1998, teaching him to balance because our own gravel driveway was built on too steep an incline. I remembered the summer he turned 16 and accidentally backed my favorite truck into a heavy wooden fence post. I told him right then that we would keep the accident between us, and we never breathed a word of it to his mother. Finally, I thought about the afternoon I handed him the keys to that beautiful house in Bend, watching him pace through the empty, sunlit rooms with his palm flat against the drywall, looking exactly like a young monarch taking stock of a brand new territory he believed he had conquered. And then, inevitably, my thoughts circled back to those 9 written words. The family that has always been there for me. By the time the clock struck 8 that morning, every single choice had been firmly made. I didn't need to sleep on it. I didn't need to seek spiritual guidance. And I certainly didn't call my brother down in Eugene to ask for his perspective on the matter, the way I might have done for a minor business dispute. I recognized with absolute certainty that if I allowed 24 hours to pass, my resolve would begin to splinter. If I allowed myself to soften, I would end up calling my boy, which would lead to a downpour of tears, frantic apologies, and complicated justifications. Those justifications would sound entirely plausible. The apologies would carry the ring of utter sincerity, and by the middle of the week, I would find myself agreeing to overlook an offense that I hadn't even fully processed yet. I had committed that exact error once before, in my youth, with my own father back in 1979, and I carried the emotional weight of that compromise for 15 long years, until the day he passed away, still retaining the apology he had promised to deliver. I was not going to repeat that mistake. Promptly at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, I dialed my legal counsel. I have retained the services of the exact same corporate firm since 1991, and the attorney who oversees my estate is a senior partner there now, a reliable, no-nonsense individual roughly a decade younger than myself. I explained exactly what I had discovered on the internet, condensing the entire situation into 3 brief sentences. He didn't offer any platitudes or ask unnecessary questions. He has practiced law long enough to recognize when a regular client has no desire for comforting conversation. I instructed him to have the Bend property listed on the open market before the week was out. I ordered the immediate removal of my son's status as a permitted occupant from any asset held within the family trust. Finally, I scheduled a formal meeting for Friday morning at his downtown offices with both him and my primary wealth manager, directing him to dispatch a formal, certified notification to my son, requiring his presence at that exact hour, without providing a single word of explanation. My attorney read the instructions back to ensure accuracy, asked once if I was entirely certain of this path, and when I confirmed, he assured me everything would be prepared. For the next 4 days, I maintained absolute silence. I ignored the 2 text messages my son sent to my device on Tuesday afternoon. The first one arrived around 2 o'clock, reading simply, "Hey Dad, got a sec?" Followed an hour later by a second message that said, "Hope everything is okay. Love you." I looked at both notifications as they blinked on the screen, but I deleted neither. I sat there, with the phone resting in my palm for a long time, staring at his words, and I chose not to reply. On Wednesday morning, the real estate agent I had commissioned through my legal counsel drove over to the Bend property to capture the interior and exterior photographs for the market listing. My son was not at the house. He was at his office downtown, where he works as a supervisor for a regional advertising agency. He secured that position 8 years ago, right after finishing his degree, because I placed a few strategic calls to the firm's owners and arranged an executive interview for him. To this day, he truly believes he won that position entirely on his own merits, and I have never done anything to correct that belief. The agent completed the photography session within 2 hours, and the property listing went live on the MLS system on Thursday at precisely noon, with an asking price of $765,000. I priced the home to sell quickly. By Thursday evening, my agent had received 3 separate offers well above our initial number, and I formally accepted one of them, an all-cash proposal with a 30-day escrow period and 0 buyer contingencies. On Friday morning, I arrived at the legal offices early and took a seat in a leather chair positioned against the back wall of the main conference room. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy door opened and my son stepped inside. He had brought his new bride along with him. She was dressed in a simple, light blue outfit and wore a slender gold cross on a chain around her neck, her face pale with visible anxiety. My son looked completely bewildered as he glanced around the room. Directly behind them marched her mother and father, 2 individuals who had received absolutely no invitation to this gathering, yet they strode into the private space with the supreme confidence of executives arriving to run a corporate board meeting. Her father was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, sporting the kind of precise, high-end haircut that comes from an upscale salon that charges a premium and refers to the service as personal grooming. He confidently extended his right hand toward me as if we were potential business partners closing a routine commercial transaction. I left his hand hanging in the air. My son looked at me, his voice shaking slightly as he said, "Dad, what is the meaning of this? Why did we get a certified letter? Who are these people?" He waved his hand toward my attorney and my wealth manager, who were sitting quietly at the center table. I looked back at him and said, "Take a seat." Then I looked at the other 3 and added, "All of you, sit down." They complied immediately. Over a long career in commerce, I have learned that when you deliver a precise command in an unhurried, steady tone, the vast majority of people will follow it without a second thought. By the time their minds register the urge to question the authority, their bodies are already settled into the chairs. I allowed the quietness in the room to stretch out for a few uncomfortable seconds. My attorney sat with a thick folder resting right in front of his hands, but he made no move to unseal it. I looked directly across the polished wood at my son and said, "I saw the wedding photographs." His expression shifted rapidly in 3 distinct stages. First came absolute blankness, then a sudden wave of recognition, and finally, the panicked look of a man who realizes he has been backed into a corner and is frantically trying to calculate which particular deception will cause the least amount of damage. He opened his mouth to launch into a defense, but I simply raised my hand to stop him. You don't need to utter a single word of explanation right now, I told him calmly. I did not call this meeting to listen to your excuses. I am here to inform you exactly how things are going to proceed from this moment forward. Once I am finished speaking, you may ask whatever questions you like, and I will choose which ones I care to answer. Underneath the table, his new wife reached over and grabbed his hand tightly. Her father cleared his throat with a loud, authoritative sound, beginning to speak in a practiced tone about minor misunderstandings and the vital importance of open communication within a family unit. I turned my head toward him very slowly, fixing him with a cold, unblinking gaze that I had learned from my own father decades ago. A harsh man who lacked kindness, but knew exactly how to dismantle an adversary with a single look. The man immediately cut his sentence short and closed his mouth. I looked back at my son. The Craftsman House in Bend has been officially sold, I stated. The transaction closes in exactly 26 days. You have until the morning of that closing to completely clear your personal effects from the interior and exterior of the property. Every single item left behind on that date will be gifted to charity or thrown into a dumpster at the absolute discretion of the incoming buyers. He stared across the table at me, his eyes wide with shock. "You can't do that," he stammered. "That's my house." And right there was the defining moment. That is the exact sentence I have replayed in the silence of my mind 1,000 times since that Friday morning. It is the phrase that comes back to haunt me when I am sitting alone in my dark house at night, listening to the mountain wind brush through the pines outside my bedroom glass. Because in those 4 short words, my boy revealed absolutely everything about how he truly viewed me. How he viewed his own standing, and how he perceived the last 7 years he had spent occupying a premium piece of real estate without ever contributing a single cent of his own money. A privilege provided out of deep paternal affection, family pride, and the simple, honest hope that he would use that stability to build a meaningful life for himself. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Your name is not on the property title. Your name has never been on that title. The legal deed is held exclusively by the family trust, and I am the sole managing trustee. I bought that home in 2018 using a direct wire transfer from my personal capital accounts. For 7 years, I have quietly covered every single property tax assessment, every insurance premium, every neighborhood association fee, every plumbing repair, every roof maintenance invoice, and every seasonal furnace inspection. You have resided under that roof strictly as my invited guest. As of 12 o'clock yesterday, I have officially revoked your invitation." He remained completely silent, his mouth slightly open as the weight of my words sank in. His new bride began to weep, the tears streaming down her face without her making a single sound. Her parents sat frozen across from me. Her mother's complexion had turned the color of chalk, while her father was staring intensely at my wealth manager, looking exactly like a drowning man fixating on a stray piece of timber floating in the current. I looked back at my son and said, "We are not finished." I then laid out the reality of the larger estate trust, the primary fund that his mother and I had established back in 1996 when he was still a young boy. A fund I had steadily grown through capital deposits over the next 20 years. For a long time, he had operated under the assumption that this account held somewhere around $400,000, a specific figure I had given him when he turned 25 and had asked me directly about his inheritance. That number had been completely accurate at the time, but only in the sense that a single sapling is technically part of a vast forest. As of that very Friday morning, the actual trust held $11,200,000 in highly diversified capital holdings. The entire estate value, when factoring in my remaining corporate shares and the properties I owned entirely across 3 different states, sat just north of $22 million. He had absolutely no inkling of that wealth. His mother and I had made a firm pact before her passing that he would remain completely in the dark until his 35th birthday. We had agreed on that timeline for reasons that felt incredibly prudent years ago, and looking at him now, I knew it was the single wisest parenting decision we had ever made. I delivered those massive numbers in the flat, unhurried tone of a broadcaster reading a routine evening weather update. I watched his expression closely, and then I shifted my gaze to his new father-in-law. The man was utterly stunned. He clearly had no idea of the true scale of my assets. I could practically see the gears turning in his head as he frantically reevaluated every single assumption he had made about my background and exactly what kind of lineage his daughter had just married into. Up until that moment, he had undoubtedly written me off as a comfortable middle-class retiree of modest capability. He had probably felt a tinge of pity for me, the quiet, unpolished widower who drove an old truck and wore faded clothes. Now, that patronizing pity drained from his face like water rushing out of a fractured pipe. I leaned forward slightly and said, "Not a single dime of that capital is going to my son. Not today, and not when I am laid in the ground." I explained that as of the previous afternoon, the trust documents had been officially amended. The named beneficiaries were now a charitable foundation bearing my late wife's name, 2 permanent endowment funds at the county college where she had spent over a decade instructing nursing students, and a dedicated fund designed to help local veterans with emergency home modifications. No one sitting on your side of this conference table will ever see a single cent of this estate, I told them. My boy let out a sharp, strangled sound from the back of his throat. It wasn't a word. It was the raw noise a person makes when something fundamental inside them snaps loose and begins to fracture. His wife's quiet weeping turned into heavy, audible sobs. Her father shifted in his chair, opening his mouth to speak again, but I instantly raised my hand, cutting him off before he could start. "I would advise you to be incredibly selective about the words you choose to utter over the next 60 seconds, I warned him coldly. Because anything that resembles a demand or a legal threat will be met with immediate, aggressive opposition. I have a digital audio recorder active on the table right in front of me, and the senior partner sitting to my right will be documenting every single syllable for our records." The father-in-law closed his mouth firmly, locking his jaw. My boy finally looked up at me, his voice cracked with emotion. "Dad, please, just listen to me. Let me explain what happened." I looked at the clock on the wall. "You have exactly 10 minutes, I stated. Choose your words wisely." He chose them incredibly poorly. He began his defense by insisting that he had fully intended to send me an invitation. He claimed he had desperately wanted me there, and had even told his bride how important it was, but that there had been a massive administrative mix-up, a chaotic scheduling conflict with the venue. He explained that they had envisioned a very small, intimate ceremony restricted solely to immediate family, and they had simply assumed I would prefer a separate, much quieter celebration, more aligned with my reserved nature. He added that they were fully planning to call me to arrange that dinner the moment they returned from their honeymoon. Then he began talking about their upcoming trip to Tuscany. He told me the exact name of the luxury villa they had booked, and he even detailed the specific historic vineyard they had scheduled a tour with the previous Tuesday. I have no idea why he thought sharing details about an Italian vineyard was a smart strategy in that moment. I think he had completely lost the thread of his own defense, and was just desperately throwing out any luxury detail he could think of, hoping his apparent happiness would somehow soften my resolve. I sat in silence and let him speak until his voice trailed off. When he finally finished, I looked across the table and asked him a single, direct question. Whose idea was it to write that caption? He sat there completely frozen, unable to find an answer. It was his new wife who finally spoke up through her tears. "It was mine," she whispered, her hands shaking. "I wrote those words without even thinking about how they would look." She looked at me with genuine terror in her eyes. "I am so incredibly sorry. I didn't mean to exclude you. I was just thinking about my own parents and how much they had helped us plan everything over the last few months. I didn't realize how cruel it would seem to you." She was weeping heavily as she spoke. And I will tell you something with complete sincerity, because I want this account to be entirely honest. I actually believed her. I could see the truth in her face. She hadn't written those words intending to use them as a weapon against me. I have raised a child, and I have managed enough people in my life to recognize a genuinely malicious person. And she wasn't one. She was simply a young woman who had married a man whose true family dynamic she didn't fully comprehend. She had composed a simple, thoughtless phrase that carried one innocent meaning in her mind, but an entirely different, devastating meaning in mine. But I also recognized the one detail that actually mattered. My son had read that exact caption before the post was published to the world. He had to have seen it. His own profile was directly tagged in the upload. He had every opportunity to look at those words and ask her to modify a single sentence. He could have suggested something simple like, "Her family has been so incredibly welcoming to me." He could have chosen 100 different phrases that honored her parents without erasing his own father. Instead, he chose to let it stand. He let it stand because in some quiet, hidden corner of his mind, he completely agreed with the sentiment. He had decided somewhere along the way that the family who funded an expensive party was more valuable to him than the father who had spent an entire lifetime building his foundation. I explained this to him slowly, clearly, and without ever raising the volume of my voice. I told him that the online post wasn't the actual injury. It was simply the moment the hidden fracture finally broke through the surface. The distance between us had been widening for years, showing up in the growing coldness of his brief phone calls, the way he consistently chose to spend his holidays at her family's lake house up in Washington, instead of sitting at my kitchen counter, and the subtle way he had stopped seeking my counsel on any major decision in his life. I had spent 3 years lying to myself, telling my own reflection that this was just a normal part of life. I told myself that boys grow up, they build their own independent lives, and they naturally stop relying on their fathers. That is supposed to be the goal of raising a son. But I had been completely wrong. What had happened to my son wasn't a natural process of maturing. He was being systematically uprooted, like a small plant carefully lifted from its original container and lowered into a completely different soil. And the new caretakers had been incredibly patient and deliberate in their work. Now, his roots were firmly planted in their earth. And when they planned a major life event and asked him to show up without the man who had tended his soil for 30 years, he hadn't even paused to question it. He began to cry right there in the law office. A grown man, 31 years of age, weeping openly in a premium leather chair. I didn't feel a single wave of triumph or satisfaction. I want to make that completely clear. I felt absolutely nothing. The freezing cold that had settled into my chest on Sunday morning remained completely undisturbed by his tears. I looked at him and said, "You have the remaining 26 days until the property closes, plus an additional 30 days of grace. After that period concludes, I want absolute silence from you." This isn't a permanent exile, but it is the reality for the foreseeable future. You will not dial my number, you will not send a text, and you will not send your wife, your in-laws, or any extended relative to act as an intermediary on your behalf. If you attempt to breach this boundary even once, the timeline will be extended indefinitely. Once the initial months have passed, I will be the one to decide if and when we communicate. That choice belongs entirely to me. You will not dispute it. You will not attempt to negotiate the terms, and you will not try to rush me." He whispered, "Dad," repeating the word 3 times in a row. "Dad, Dad, Dad." He spoke it as if the title itself were a magical key that could unlock a door I had just bolted shut. It changed nothing. Her father decided to make one final attempt to salvage the situation. He leaned forward, adopting a measured tone, and said, "Surely we can come to a mutual agreement here. Our daughter and her husband require a stable place to live. Surely you don't actually intend to throw them out onto the street. We are rational, professional people. We are fully prepared to contribute financially to a proper solution." I fixed my eyes on him. "I understand from my son that you are a highly successful businessman," I replied. "In fact, I was informed that you offered to write a personal check for the property the moment you discovered it was hitting the market. $750,000. Was that the exact amount?" My son had panicked earlier in the week and relayed that information to my attorney, who had immediately passed it along to me. I let that massive number hang in the quiet air of the room. It had certainly made an impression on my son. I could read it in his face. He had viewed that offer as absolute proof that his new family was rushing to his defense, demonstrating they possessed both the wealth and the desire to step in exactly where his own father had abandoned him. I continued, "That is an incredibly affluent gesture, and I genuinely respect it. If you have $750,000 in liquid cash ready to deploy on behalf of your daughter and her husband, then they are nowhere near the brink of homelessness. You have a daughter, and she has a husband. You are wealthy enough, by your own admission, to clear a massive financial transaction on 24 hours' notice. So, buy them a house. Buy them a condominium. Buy them a luxury tent to pitch in your own backyard. The absolute resolution to their housing dilemma is sitting right on your side of this conference table. It is no longer my concern. It ceased to be my problem at exactly 6:43 a.m. on Sunday morning." A deep, dark color rushed into the father-in-law's face, a look of pure humiliation I hadn't witnessed on another human being in a very long time. He had walked into that office fully intending to play the part of the magnanimous savior. He wanted to be the gracious benefactor who would smoothly resolve the family dispute and walk out looking like the superior man. I had taken his own grand gesture, sharpened the edges, and handed it back to him point first. He didn't offer a single word in response. He couldn't. There was no counter-argument that didn't either force him to actually spend the $750,000 he had used as a bluff or expose him as a complete fraud in front of his family. My boy turned his head to look at his father-in-law. He stared at him with a specific, hollow expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a 14-year-old kid. It had been over a decade since I last thought about that look, but I recognized it instantly. It was the look of a child suddenly realizing that the adult they pinned all their faith on was not actually going to fix the disaster. It was the exact same expression he wore the afternoon his mother sat him down to explain how sick she was. And his eyes had immediately darted over to me, desperately searching for the version of reality where I would tell him it was all just a mistake. I hadn't been able to give him that comforting lie back then, and his wealthy new father-in-law wasn't going to pull out a checkbook to save him now. I stood up from my chair. "My legal counsel has the necessary exit paperwork ready for your signatures," I announced. "Sign the documents or leave them blank. The choice is entirely yours. If you cooperate, the transition moves forward quickly. If you refuse, my attorney will simply execute the process through the courts. The end result remains identical. Either way, that structure will be completely vacant by the specified date. I am leaving this office now. Do not follow me to the elevators." I walked out of the room, took the elevator down to the garage, and drove back to my property. I fixed myself a quiet meal. Then I walked out onto my back porch, where the new wooden planks I had installed the previous weekend sat raw and visibly lighter than the weathered boards surrounding them. I sat there watching a lone hawk ride the wind currents over the open meadow behind my house, and for the first time in 5 long days, I felt a slight shift in my chest. The freezing cold was still there, but it had finally paused its expansion. For nearly 2 full months, absolute silence remained between us. Then, a single physical letter arrived in my mailbox, contained in a plain white envelope bearing a standard postage stamp. It appeared 6 weeks after our volatile confrontation in the downtown law office. For a long time, I just stood there at my kitchen counter, turning the paper over in my hands, seriously considering throwing it directly into the ironwood stove without breaking the seal. But at 68 years old, you learn that certain messages must be faced, because if you choose to leave them unread, your mind will spend every remaining year fabricating the contents. And the version your mind constructs in the dark will invariably be far more toxic than whatever is written on the page. The letter stretched across 4 full sheets of paper, composed entirely in his own distinct handwriting. A script I hadn't seen since his university days, given that every interaction between us over the last decade had been restricted to text messages and digital files. He apologized. He expressed deep remorse for the wedding concealment, for the public caption, and for the gradual, freezing distance he had allowed to form between us long before either event took place. He detailed the holidays he had thoughtlessly skipped, the phone calls he had left unreturned, and the slow, unconscious manner in which he had begun treating my presence as a permanent guarantee rather than a gift. He informed me that he had completely vacated the Craftsman home in Bend precisely on the date required. He and his bride had secured a modest, 1-bedroom apartment in a working-class district of West Eugene. Furthermore, he had taken on a secondary night position handling freight shipments at a commercial warehouse off the main commercial avenue. He explained that his regular salary at the advertising agency simply wasn't sufficient to cover both their monthly rent and the ongoing payments on his college loans. Payments he hadn't realized I had been quietly liquidating on his behalf out of a private holding account for the past 3 years. He wrote that he had been completely oblivious to those automated transactions until his mother-in-law explicitly asked why his outstanding balance was so remarkably low for a young professional who had never initiated a single payment. Upon auditing his financial statements, he discovered the capital had been arriving from an anonymous corporate entity. He retained a researcher to trace the registration, and the trail led straight back to my personal estate office. He admitted he had broken down and wept for an hour at his desk when that realization hit him. He wrote that during those hours of clarity, he finally understood that every ounce of resentment he had harbored against me over the years was a completely fabricated narrative he had told himself to justify his own shortcomings. He had resented me for being emotionally distant, yet I was the invisible pillar funding his entire existence. He had resented me for being rigid and controlling, yet I was the one quietly absorbing the costs of his life, so he had the freedom to fail safely. He had resented me for not displaying affection through the loud, theatrical declarations and grand public gestures his new father-in-law specialized in. He now saw that I had loved him in the exact way my own father had never loved me, by carrying his heaviest burdens in absolute silence and allowing him to believe he was standing entirely on his own 2 feet. He explicitly stated he was not writing to beg for his inheritance back, nor was he seeking a return to the house in Bend. He wanted absolutely none of it. His only request was that when the mandatory 2-month period of silence concluded, I might consider allowing him to buy me a simple lunch. Not a formal dinner, not a holiday gathering, just a single hour at any plain diner of my choosing. He wrote that he entirely understood if my answer was no, or if the answer was simply not yet. He was fully prepared to wait, however many years I required. And he had explicitly informed his wife that this was a fracture she could not patch for him. It was a debt he had to clear entirely on his own. I read through those 4 pages 3 separate times, sitting at the exact same wooden kitchen table where I had consumed that bitter cold coffee 2 months prior. I read his words, and my eyes remained dry, because weeping is not a habit I fall into easily. But for the very first time in those 60 days, I felt the sharp, icy mass inside my chest begin to thaw slightly around the edges. I didn't draft a response immediately. I forced myself to wait an additional 2 weeks. I wanted the original timeline I had established to completely expire, allowing a few extra days to pass so he would know his written words hadn't managed to manipulate me into changing my terms before the clock ran out. The authority had to remain mine. The calendar had to remain mine. That detail was absolutely paramount. And looking back, I believe he truly respected that boundary because he didn't attempt to call or send a follow-up message during those final weeks. When I finally put pen to paper, my response consisted of exactly 3 sentences. Lunch on the 18th, 12:30 p.m. The old diner on the bypass across from the lumber yard. Come alone, bring nothing. He was already sitting inside the booth when I arrived at the diner, positioned right by the window and wearing an old flannel shirt I had purchased for him as a Christmas gift back in 2022. The moment I crossed the threshold, he stood straight up. He made no movement to initiate a hug, standing quietly and waiting for me to take my seat before he returned to his. A single mug of black coffee sat in front of him. He hadn't ordered a thing to eat. We sat in that booth and talked for exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes. I have no intention of detailing what transpired between us during those minutes, because certain private conversations belong strictly to the people who live them, not to the telling. I will share only this. When the time ran out, I didn't offer him any grand promises. I didn't restore his name to my will. I didn't hand back the keys to the Bend house, and I didn't even tell him that he was forgiven. Forgiveness is a heavyweight word that I treat with immense caution, and I have learned through a long life that uttering it before you truly mean it is no different than telling a flat-out lie. What I actually told him before I stood up was that we could meet for lunch again in exactly 3 months. Same location, same hour, same strict conditions. And if that meeting went well, we would schedule another one 3 months after that. That initial meeting occurred a 1.5 years ago. We just concluded lunch number 6. He and his wife have managed to transition into a slightly larger apartment in that same neighborhood, and he continues to clock in for those grueling night shifts at the warehouse. He hasn't uttered a single syllable asking for financial assistance, nor has he hinted at wanting anything from my estate. His wife dispatched a simple, polite holiday card to my address last December. I permitted it to sit on my living room mantel for an appropriate duration, before placing it away in a desk drawer. I haven't seen her face since that day in the law office. I will eventually, but I am in absolute no hurry to rush the process. I suppose you are waiting for the conclusion now. The way people always stick around until the final sentences of an account, waiting for the elderly narrator to hand over the moral of the story. I will tell you exactly what this experience has taught me. I have learned that affection and respect are 2 entirely distinct forms of currency, and any man who mistakes one for the other will eventually find himself completely bankrupt, staring at his empty palms without ever understanding how he lost it all. I have learned that the most profoundly generous act a parent can perform for an adult child is, at times, the total withdrawal of material generosity. Because a child who is carried across every rough patch will inevitably begin to mistake the lifting arms for the actual floor. I have learned that the individuals who loudly proclaim they have always been there for you Whether they write it in a public internet caption, shout it during a wedding toast, or print it inside a greeting card, are almost always the ones who have occupied the smallest, easiest stretches of your existence. The people who have actually stood in the trenches with you are far too exhausted and far too quiet to ever boast about it. And finally, I have learned that the freezing clarity that gripped my chest on that Sunday morning at 6:43 a.m. was not an act of cruelty at all. It was actually the final, lasting lesson my late wife ever imparted to me, even though she had been resting in the churchyard for 7 years by the time I finally understood it. She looked at me once, decades ago when our boy was just a little child throwing a frantic tantrum over a plastic toy, and she told me that you can hold a fierce love for your child and still have the strength to let him fall. You can love him with your whole heart and still force him to learn exactly what the hard ground feels like. I had completely forgotten that wisdom. I had spent 15 years sprinting forward to catch him before he ever made contact with the earth, and my constant protection had taught him only one devastating lie: that the ground wasn't a real thing. It is real to him now. He understands its weight perfectly. And perhaps in another year, or 2, or 5, I will be capable of looking across that diner table at his face without instantly visualizing that online photograph, without seeing the tailored suit, the elaborate archway of white roses, or those 9 thoughtless words. I am not at that point yet, but I am undeniably closer than I was when this started. As for that mug of coffee, the one that turned ice cold on a quiet Sunday morning in October, I eventually poured it down the kitchen sink and washed the porcelain clean. I have used that exact same mug every single morning since. And when I hold it in my hands now, it doesn't feel cold anymore. I have spent an immense amount of time during the months following that first meeting near the lumberyard, trying to decipher why a son who was granted every conceivable advantage ended up carrying so much hidden resentment toward the man who provided it. I don't believe my boy is a malicious individual. I believe he is an entirely ordinary human being, and ordinary human beings, when they are carried through life for too long, simply stop noticing the strength of the arms beneath them. The error wasn't entirely his to bear. It belonged to me, and it belonged to his mother, because of the specific way we constructed his reality. We built a beautiful, secure world for him without ever requiring him to erect a single load-bearing wall with his own hands. Cause and effect is the only unbreakable law I recognize in this life. A home provided in absolute silence will be received in absolute silence. A college loan wiped away without a word produces a young man who genuinely believes he cleared the debt through his own merit. A father who never demands basic respect creates a son who never even thinks to offer it. Every single choice I made out of deep paternal love, every automated transfer I authorized without an explanation, and every comfort I quietly engineered behind the scenes was just another heavy brick I laid into the path that led directly to that Sunday morning upload. I don't regret loving my child with that intensity. My only true regret is that I never allowed him to see what that love actually cost to build, and because he never saw the price, he never truly understood what it was worth. If there is a single piece of hard-won knowledge I could pass down to a younger man processing these words, it would be 3 minor principles. They aren't original to my thinking. They were taught to me incredibly late in life, and at an extraordinary personal expense. The first principle is character. A man's true character isn't defined by the statements he makes when the audience is watching. It is forged entirely by what he does at 6:43 a.m. on a Sunday morning when he believes he is completely invisible. My boy's character was put to the test by a simple social media caption, and he failed the baseline exam. But that failure was incredibly useful, because failure is the only completely honest mirror we possess in this world. He recognizes now exactly what kind of man he was operating as back then. He is actively working to become an entirely different individual now, moving slowly and on his own time. And that painful process of reconstruction is the only thing in this entire account that belongs strictly to him. The second principle is wisdom. True wisdom is the vast gulf between understanding a concept intellectually and having paid for that concept out of your own skin. I understood perfectly well on a cognitive level that it is possible to love a child to a damaging degree. But I had to endure 2 solid months of total estrangement and the complete loss of his company before that truth finally settled into my bones. There is absolutely no shortcut to that specific kind of knowing. Anyone who attempts to convince you otherwise is simply trying to sell you a product. The third principle is the one I hold in the highest regard, and it is the exact quality that young people today seem the least interested in developing. The simple, unyielding capacity to endure a brutal reality without flinching. I didn't flinch on that Sunday morning when my world shattered. I didn't flinch when I sat against the wall in that law office. I didn't flinch when his handwritten letter arrived in my mailbox. And I didn't flinch when I poured that bitter, cold liquid down the drain. The flinch is the thing that destroys you, not the actual pain of the wound. To flinch is the exact moment a man chooses to trade his lasting self-respect for a temporary second of relief. And once he executes that desperate trade, he will spend every remaining breath trying to purchase that respect back at a price his soul simply cannot afford. I am not a wise man. I am just an old one who has survived his choices. But these 3 final things, character, wisdom, and the absolute steadiness to stand exactly where you are planted, are the only assets I have left to my name. And I am passing them over to you now, because no one had the nerve to give them to me until the clock had almost run out. If you found this story powerful, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more raw, honest human stories. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode, and share your thoughts on today's moral in the comments below. Thank you for listening.